Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week is retired U.S. Army Colonel Mike Dowe. He's also a veteran of the Korean War and was held as a prisoner of war. He was also a close witness to the actions of U.S. Army chaplain Father Emil Kapaun, who was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroism in Korea. Colonel Dowe began our discussion by explaining how a family connection made him determined to serve this nation and attend West Point from a young age.
When I was a kid, my uncle was commandant and was brought up there by my grandfather visiting him in the summers. And that impressed me with West Point. So although I wanted to be a civil engineer like my daddy and graduated early because I'd walked into school when I was 4 years old, so I went to RPI for did a couple years there, and then went to West Point.
What was that experience like for you? Was it what you expected?
West Point was pretty much what I did expect after being oriented by my uncle as to what to expect.
What do you remember most from that? How did it shape you?
The West Point experience was a tremendous shaping thing. It is for anybody. It gives you a total impact on one of the most important aspects of leadership, and that's integrity, as well as giving you the academic equipment to really work in diversified fields. With a one-year basis in physics, I ended up getting my doctorate in nuclear physics. And that another interesting thing about the West Point curriculum, I worked a lot for Edward Teller, the fellow that did the hydrogen bomb, and he had us do these Hertz Foundation interviews. And we would interview all of the universities and the military academies for selection for these fellowships. And West Point was awarded more than any of the other schools, and it wasn't just me, it was a broad number of people interviewing. And that was because, I'd say a fellow from MIT, could go really deep in his area, but with the basis that West Point had given these guys, they were broad enough to apply their learning to all kinds of situations. One of the big values, I think, of a West Point education was this rather generic basis that allowed him to pursue and think more than in just a single channel, but broadly and apply themselves.
When did you graduate from West Point?
1950.
1950, okay.
Went straight from graduation to Korean War.
Wow. And you were attached to what unit?
19th Infantry, 24th Infantry Division.
And where were you when you first saw combat?
I was end of August. We were in the Naktong perimeter, and when I joined the unit, it had a forward bivouac location. It was in reserve, but we were there just a couple days when there was a breakthrough on the coast of the ROK Capital Division by the North Koreans. They could have walked to Pusan if they had realized that there was nothing left between them and Pusan. So they rushed us over there to counter that breakthrough, and that was my first real active combat.
What was it like for the first time?
Well, I'll tell you a story. Went out on a reconnaissance the night before, and of the hill that I was supposed to take with my platoon. And so the next morning, we launched the attack. And as I got to the hill, unknown to me and not on a map or anything, short of the hill there was a little canyon. So Now, to approach that hill, it looked like it might be suicide because going down into that canyon and then climbing up the other side, it was just, all somebody had to do was drop a hand grenade in and just wipe the people out. Well, we went down there. I just decided, well, can't fail my first attack. I went down there, climbed up the other hill, and the North Koreans, had deployed themselves anchored on that canyon, but had nobody facing the canyon. And we were able to wipe out every one of them without a single casualty. Looking down, we saw their whole battalion headquarters, or bigger headquarters, in line for chow. We were able to call in air on them and watch the F-51s napalm the whole area and eliminate them. That was my first combat experience, but what it taught me is the value of going in the direction that is least expected rather than taking the most obvious route. And it certainly paid off for me that day.
As the autumn progressed and the Allies pushed north, did you think you'd be home for Christmas?
Yes, in fact, we sent the assistant lieutenant in the company headquarters back with a group to Japan to prepare the victory parade for us. It was to take place in Thanksgiving, and came close to that, but never did make it.
Yeah. So you got up to the Yalu River, and then the Chinese came flooding across. What was your reaction when you saw that?
Well, reaction was not fun. The situation that we had fought all the way up there, and really we defeated the North Korean army. What was left of it had escaped into China, but they were so disorganized there was really nothing there. The 19th Infantry was on the west coast, and my battalion was in the lead, and my company was in the lead in the battalion, and we reached the dam over the Yalu River at Sinawiju on the afternoon of 2 November. We could hear fighting off to our right, but battalion told me to keep my GIs off this bridge dam over the river because they didn't want to irritate the Chinese on the other side of the river. Little did we know that the noise we were hearing on our right was the incursion of the Chinese communists. The Chi-Coms were attacking the CAV on our right, and we were pushed back that night in a forced march to Anju, and then pushed up a road that wasn't on the map to cover for a rock division that was on the right of the CAV that had also been hit by the Chinese. So that was the night of the 2nd. The day of the 3rd, we deployed our positions on blocking position on that road, and that morning of the 4th, the remnants of that division passed through. They were a mess, what was left. Sometime around 11 or 12 that day, I was assembling my carbine, and I had sitting in my foxhole, had my tent behind me, and all of a sudden, poop, 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 and I looked at the tent, and all kinds of bullet holes were appearing. I put that carbine back together pretty fast, and we were the reserve of the company, and the company was the reserve of the battalion. And the Chinese had just come around the roadblock and were attacking from the rear. They wiped out our weapons company, dog company, just walked right through them, wiped out the battalion, and so we were left there fighting them. One platoon on the right of the road and my platoon on the left. And they just came at us in waves, blowing bugles and screaming, and that went on for a couple of hours. The other two companies were supposed to counterattack through us, but instead they decided to go out around us. Some people would call it a bug out. Some people would say that the commander of those companies who disobeyed the order of our company commander, who was senior, he was told to counterattack through us. Instead, he went out around us. And even when they were completely clear of the combat, back toward Anjou, a couple miles, they were telling us, hold, we're counterattacking through us. So when finally we ran out of ammunition, our company commander, fantastic guy, Louis Rockwork, one of the old battling bastards of Bastogne, couldn't have had a better company commander, gave us out of ammunition, said thermite the jeeps and things, which we did, and let's try to get out of here. I had 3 people left in my platoon. Bill Fonches had 6 in his as we left. One of the guys, I had 4 guys to start, I thought, and one of the guys, instead of pulling out when he was told, Corporal Goss stood there catching grenades from the Chinese and throwing them back. He was found later with a bunch of dead Chinese around him. Worked with General Dean when I got back, and I was hoping to get him a Medal of Honor, but all they gave him was a Bronze Star. But we would have never gotten off the hill if it wasn't for Goss. As we started off, a bullet hit Fongo, Lieutenant Fonches, the other fellow that had 6 people left, and I had 3. And he said, Mike, you're not going to leave me, are you? And so I picked him up and was carrying him. And we were going up a ridge line that overviewed the valley that the battalion was in. And we told the people to be quiet. But looking back, it just looked like a very normal activity in the battalion CP. And one of the GIs that was with us said, all of a sudden shouted out, "Are you GIs?" And with that, they set up a real barrage there as we went up that draw. And actually I got hit, but we kept going and we went over the hill. And as we came down, they had troops ready to grab us. And we didn't have any ammunition, they just physically grabbed us. One thing we never thought of was being prisoners, because as we moved up, we had come to places where we'd seen U.S. prisoners who had been tortured, mutilated, and tortured with spears, burn holes in them with burning spears. Have pictures of those that later, when I got back, were all assembled for the war crimes thing. But so you never thought of becoming a prisoner, and yet here we were. So we didn't know what to expect. The Chinese, though, played games with us. They didn't torture us, actually. They tied me in a way that if I moved, it just made it tighter. Then they played what pretended they were doing Russian roulette with a pistol, running it around, putting my head and pulling the trigger and laughing when it didn't go off, of course. But that wasn't fun. But that was my first experience on being captured. Then they took us to the schoolhouse, and there we were joined with the people who had voluntarily stayed behind when the CAV broke out at Unsan. And among them was Chaplain Emil Kapaun, greatest man I've ever met. A lot to say about him.
There is a lot that Colonel Dowe will say about the heroism of Father Cappone right after this brief pause here on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week is retired U.S. Army Colonel Mike Dowe. He is a Korean War veteran who was also held as a prisoner of war. As we pick up the story, Colonel Dowe explains the remarkable heroism of Army Chaplain Father Emil Kapaun while they were in captivity. We should set the stage a little bit. Conditions in the camp are not good. You're badly malnourished. There's lots of disease running through the camp, and people are dying. The selflessness of Father Kapaun it's almost hard to put into words. What was your first experience with him, and when did you realize he was someone extraordinary?
Well, when we were on this so-called death march, where anybody that couldn't dropped out at all, hear a soldier drop back and you'd hear a shot, and that was then. So we had to keep everybody moving, the wounded and carrying the wounded so that they wouldn't drop out. Father Cappone, the Chinese would immediately say, don't pay any attention to your officers, you don't have to pay attention to them anymore. There was this one guy that really, by example, was getting more people to carry wounded than anybody else. I didn't know who it was at the time. When a few days later we got to the destination where it was to be the prison camp, and when we got there, there was a firebombing of the city. So they put us on this hillside until the bombing was over, decided that they couldn't leave us there. So they marched us back into a valley. Well, when we picked up the stretchers to go, I was walking along, and a guy on the back of it said, I'm Mike Dowe, who are you? And he said, Cappone. I said, Father Cappone, I've heard of you. He said, well, don't tell my bishop. So he started right there. In that valley, this is before we ended up coming back to Pyeongtaung, to Cap 5. In that valley, during that period before January, the death rate in two other camps, a mining camp and there's another one, I forget the name of it right now, the death rate in those camps was 10 times what it was in Cappone, the Cappone's Valley, sometimes called Happy Valley. And it all stems as, without a doubt, from the kind of spirit that he engendered. And he would steal food, sneak out past the guards, steal food, deliver it to the GIs, encourage them to keep faith with their country and their God, and in other words, engender a will to live in a rather hopeless situation. And that means everything. When you're starving and when things seem hopeless, if you can keep faith with your basic principles, you can retain the will to live. And that's what he did, not only there, but then when we moved to Camp 5, it wasn't Camp 5 yet then, it was just Pyeongtaung, where everybody was. They had an officers' camp up on top of the hill, and then the GIs and houses going on the way down the hill to the river and off to the left a little bit, but below was a Turkish camp. And Father would sneak past the guards and go in and help the GIs, encourage them, drop in on them, even the Turks, everybody. He treated everybody the same. I was very fortunate because Father Cappone slept right by me in the same house. These were little 6x6 rooms that had about 18 people in, so you kind of went head to toe across the line, as long as there were people alive that made up that number. And the whole idea of encouraging people to pick their life and maintain this will to live, but there's more than that. Here's a person who would lie there at night with us, and when we would dream of different foods, we'd think up menus and talk about it. Father was fantastic with the country Thanksgiving or something. His mother would make on the farm back in Kansas. He would hit all with menus. But he was inventive, too. He would get up, well, he started by getting up in the morning and be ahead of us, get some kind of a fire going, and then boil water, and he'd come around with this hot water, coffee, and man, I'll tell you, that water that in the morning like that, in a situation where you're in an environment where it's 20 to 40 below, this was the worst winter Korea had, in summer clothes, that hot coffee, well, it wasn't exactly his final coffee. His final coffee, he decided he would parch these goleon beans that we were fed and put them in a GI sock and dip that in boiling water. And man, he had real coffee for us. That was fantastic. Well, in making all this time, he was scrounging food and delivering it to the GIs along the way, sneaking past the guards to do it. And his exploits, he was doing some tin, making a bowl with some tin one day that one of them piece flew up and hit him in the eye, put out his eye, put an eye patch on it. And to have the influence that this guy had, here's a guy, if you can picture it, in a stocking cap pulled down over his head with a scraggly beard and a patch over his eye, and still he walks into one of these huts, and just his presence made it just a wonderful place to be for a moment. And he would be able to instill the will to live in so many people. Well, you know, over 1,000, a couple thousand there, and half of them died from it. But those of us who survived, almost everybody will attribute their likelihood of their survival to Father Kapaun.
He, of course, didn't survive.
No, he was killed. They were afraid of him. He defied them on Easter. Although they said there was not to be any religious service in this old, broken, burned-out church right above the Auschwitz compound, he gave his religious service. And by the way, the hymns were carried, or the GIs picked them up, America the Beautiful and things like that was sung all the way through the valley. It was beautiful. The next Sunday, he collapsed in his regular sermon, and he had a blood clot in his leg. It took him, several weeks to recover from that. He did recover from that, and then we all got pneumonia. He was recovering from that, but the Chinese were afraid for him to recover because he built so much resistance to them, and so they hauled him off in spite of us, in spite of our doctors saying that he's getting well, we're taking care of him. They hauled him off, and later I was at this place, and they had a sort of a ward at one end, and then at the other end was this little 6x6 building that when people became incontinent or whatnot, they just put them in there to die. And instead of putting him in the ward to where he'd have a chance, they dumped him right into this death house that all they did was put them in there to die, and it was just nothing in there but feces and maggots and things. Didn't feed them or anything. And then they just took the remains and threw them in a pile down below in the hill, and that's where his remains went, to this mass grave there. So they killed him because they didn't know how to handle him. They couldn't cope with somebody that engendered such faith in their country and in their beliefs.
What was it like in the camp without him?
And the camp without him, his inspiration really carried on in the camp. You'll hear that from the survivors, how his inspiration meant so much. One lesson that I think carries through even to the military, all the military today, that probably not very well known. When I came back, I had the honor of being the Army representative to the Eisenhower Committee to formulate a code of conduct for our armed forces. The Air Force had a position that after 30 days a person should be able to say or do whatever they want. They were concerned because this Colonel Schwabel and a couple people had given these germ warfare confessions, and it had been a big propaganda thing for the communists. The position that I took for the Army was that if a person compromises himself and compromises his belief, he's got much less a chance to live. And I used the examples of Father Cappone as the basis for that. And the Army won. The position that was taken in the Code of Conduct reflects directly Father Cappone's beliefs.
Fantastic. Congratulations. While you were in camp, were there rumors going around about the war ending and possible release, or did you hear nothing about that?
There was constant negotiations. I wrote some plays and some songs and whatnot that were sung. In fact, I was on the return. The communists didn't like me because every one of the plays, they were coordinated with our escape committee, and I would be thrown in the hole or thrown in jail, whatever they call it, for my acts and abuse of the communists. So on the return, there was this song that I got going. Everybody sung, and so they decided that was me. And so I was one of a half a dozen people that were pulled out and tried and for their crimes against the people, and actually convicted. So this took place down at Panmunjom. So over about 100 yards away was this tent of people that was to be exchanged, and the 6 or a half dozen of us that were to be sent back to China. So I'd escaped a couple times and been caught, but I decided this is as close as you'll ever be to escaping, and so 100 yards away. So I took the traditional way. At the end of building was a binjo, which had 2 boards that you squat on. In the back was a place where the honey wagon guy came through and dipped the material out, and they used it for fertilizer. So dropped down through that, kind of crappy way to escape, but out through the hole, roll around in the grass and get as much off as you can. And then I got into the group that was being exchanged. And so they just, the last group that was there, instead of calling a roll, they just put that group on the truck. Then when they got them to Panmunjom, to the exchange point, they went through the roster, and when they got down to the end, I was standing there, and the guy looked at me because there wasn't another name, and I just pointed his board and said Dowe and crossed the bridge before he could do anything. And that was how I got back.
What did that feel like? What did freedom feel like after all?
Oh, I'll tell you. It was wonderful. A classmate was waiting for me on the other side. G2 had said that they thought I was coming back. Little did they know what had happened to me on the way. But They took me directly to Tokyo and put me in a hospital there, and then feeded me with dinners and whatnot. But I couldn't eat. I couldn't enjoy the rich food. Your stomach was not adapted to good food. In fact, when I got home, it was horrible because everybody wanted to give you dinners and whatnot, and you just, after having that plain food, that first winter you lived on nothing but millet, which was birdseed, and cracked corn, and eventually goulion. And your stomach, your digestive system, I'll guarantee you, a U.S. digestive system, is not made to digest birdseed and live on it. And that's what just drove everybody into malnutrition. Well, now you come back and you get just the opposite. There's wonderful, rich food, and your digestive system isn't adapted to that right away either.
Colonel, we just have a couple minutes left in our conversation here, and I know you stayed in the service. You served as a unit commander later on, and you've been in the defense industry for decades. When you think back to your time in Korea and you see the difference between North and South Korea today, what comes to mind, especially after all you went through?
What comes to mind is, it's a shame we didn't go through and finish the job to begin with. It's left hanging, and today it poses one of the major strategic threats our country faces. We have a situation where the person in charge in North Korea, a wonderful dictator there, really doesn't seem rational at times. How he can think he can threaten the United States is really hard to say. I've been back there when they took me back, thought a kind of hero trip thing. And it was interesting. At Panmunjom, he went into these tunnels that they had built. You could take a regiment through those tunnels in a couple of hours. And they did them and disposed of the dirt in them without, in a way that our satellites couldn't see, evidently putting the dirt into underground streams of some sort. They have make every move in terms of actually again attacking South Korea. And here, right within artillery range of that border, you have one of the biggest, most beautiful metropolises in the world. A place that is jammed in rush hour like nothing. Gee, when we were there, the railroad station was the tallest building. Now it's just dwarfed. There was one bridge across the Coom River, and you could only put one vehicle across it at a time. Today there are many bridges, and where we used to trade burp guns to the pilots on the airfield on the south side of the Coom River, there's nothing but a museum where that airfield used to be now. And we'd trade the burp guns for whiskey to the pilots. And and Bob Hope came there to Pyongyang while we were there in North Korea. Yeah, it was a job we didn't finish. And boy, are we threatened, and the world is threatened at the present time as a result.
That's retired U.S. Army Colonel Mike Dowe, a veteran of the Korean War, where he was also a prisoner of war. There's a recent footnote as well to the story of Father Emil Kapaun. You may remember Colonel Dowe explaining that Capone's body was thrown into a mass grave at the prison camp. Hundreds of unidentified remains were moved from Korea to Hawaii shortly after the end of major combat operations in Korea. And in March 2021, the remains of Father Kapaun were positively identified, nearly 70 years after his death. Father Kapaun's remains are scheduled to be buried in a crypt at the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception in Wichita, Kansas. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Karumbas, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.